I'm not on. Yeah, I am. Thank you. All right, so we like to keep you busy at Rise. And so welcome to one of our 3 lunch and learn sessions. This is called Pathways to Housing. And we keep it pretty casual during lunch, but we are honored to present a conversation between Miro Weinberger, the executive chair of Let's Build Homes, former mayor of Burlington, and also a fellow in the Patrick Leahy Honors College. Is that what you're called? And Alex Farrell, who's the Commissioner of Housing and Community Development for the state of Vermont. I'm going to leave it up to you guys. There are some slides, correct? Okay, do we have a clicky thing? Ha-ha. Green button. The big green button or the little green button? Okay. Who's going first?
I can kick off.
Okay.
Sure.
All right. Enjoy, everybody.
All right, thank you. So like Emma said, I'm Alex Farrell. I'm the commissioner at the Department of Housing and Community Development. Excited to be presenting with Miro here. We teamed up quite a bit during the legislative session, and it's going to be a lot more partnership between the state and Let's Build Homes going forward. So I'm going to set the stage a little bit, just give some context, and then I'll talk a little bit about what happened in the legislative session. And then we can go to Q&A before Miro kicks it off. So I am going, okay, eventually my slides are going to come up, I suppose. Oh, do we have, okay, here we go. Okay, so this is the breaking news. We have a housing crisis, and it's a little bit more nuanced than just a shortage of units, but that's really what you're going to hear us talking a lot about, because there's a lot of education that we're trying to do, Let's Build Homes is trying to do around just how far we have fallen short on units. But beyond just the units, it's also about our rural communities and trying to revitalize the economic centers in rural Vermont. So this isn't just, we don't want to exacerbate the 2 Vermonts that we've heard about for decades. So this is a graph that you may or may not have seen before. What you're looking at is the number of units permitted over time. So starting from the 70s here, and you can see all the way up to today. Now, what I wished I had done before today is shown you the first half of that, stopping at 1987, where there's that great big point. Because then I like to ask people, how many units do you think we're building today? And if you looked at that first half, and you were to just guess how many units we were building 40 years later, I'm guessing you would think 8,000, 10,000. But you can see a precipitous drop. And there are a few reasons for this, some of which we'll talk about here today, others we can talk about later. But there's a precipitous drop after the 1980s, which we never really rebounded from. And then another really tough time for building permits here in Vermont around the Great Recession. And again, not only did the number of units never recover from that dip in 08 to 09, the building industry never recovered. So keep in mind, as Miro and I talk, that's another constraint that we're working against here, is that the industry itself never fully rebounded. Okay, we'll come back to this. This is just another way to see the same thing, but I think puts that last chart in perspective. We were building, as a percentage of the existing housing stock, we were building at a pretty good clip in the 80s. And even prior to that, when you see this same chart go back to the 50s, 60s, 70s, in the 60s and 70s, we did an okay job too. And you can see that what we have, our issue, is decades in the making. There's been a lot of talk about the housing crisis and the effect that the pandemic had on the housing crisis. That's all absolutely true. I'm getting a little too casual with my arm up here. I've got a full couch, so I'm trying to... But it wasn't an all-of-a-sudden crisis. We did this to ourselves, and we did it for decades. We just finally felt it more acutely, and we're seeing really, really damaging results, especially to the most vulnerable. So... what have we done? It's not all bad news. We've done some great stuff. Apologies for the small text here, but what I'll cover at a high level is the last handful of years, and really I'm talking about since 2020. So the pandemic did give us an opportunity to throw a lot of money at housing, but it was also a great test case. So in years prior to the pandemic, we tried to find ways to scrounge up money for housing. And the governor and the nonprofit housing industry teamed up. And in 2018, this is pre-pandemic here, teamed up for the largest, at the time, housing investment in Vermont's history, with a bond to raise $37 million to build housing, to create one-time funds to build housing. $37 million. That was, at the time, the largest single investment in housing in Vermont's history. And then ARPA funds through the pandemic came, and we invested $600 million just in fiscal year 21 through 25. 4 fiscal years, $600 million. So we basically got to say, hey, all these years where we said, if only we had a little more money, if only we had a little more money, well, here's all of the money and more than we could have ever hoped for. Did that solve the problem? It didn't. It really has helped. I don't want to give the impression it hasn't helped. It has helped a lot. We've made a lot of progress, but it proved a couple key things, which is some of the focus of my team in the state and Miro's team, which is we have systems that are not meeting the moment in housing, that are intentionally constraining housing. And I use that word intentionally because this has been done intentionally. We have stopped development on purpose, which means it's going to take years of intentionally unwinding and reforming these systems. So, talking about reform, we have seen some great steps towards regulatory reform, one of them being the HOME Act. In 2023, so one of the big constraints in housing is restrictive zoning. Our municipalities saying you can build a new home, but the minimum lot size is X. In some communities, that's been 3 acres, it's been 2 acres. Vermont has the largest average lot size in the country. Little Vermont, largest average lot size. So that's what the HOME Act was going after, saying, hey, municipalities, if you have things like water system, wastewater systems, you need to enable more density. Private property owners could still choose or not choose to build housing there, but you need to enable it. You can't require so many parking spaces in certain areas. So all of these steps that were taken were really aimed at allowing for more density, more housing, especially where we have infrastructure. You're going to hear a theme. Miro and I are going to talk a lot about the need for infrastructure and then maximizing that infrastructure. So that was 2023 with the HOME Act. That was a great step. 2024, Act 181. Again, another great step in reforming how we permit housing and development in the state of Vermont. This was focused rather than on local zoning, now looking at state permitting. Can I see, show of hands, who knows about Act 250 or who knows what Act 250 is? That's pretty good. All right. So Act 181 was an attempt to reform Act 250, carve out areas where perhaps we could exempt certain activities from Act 250. Hey, you can build some housing there. And other areas, we're going to increase protection, such as critical natural resource areas. There's a robust debate about whether the right balance was struck, but again, we'll get into that later. So some reform at the local level, some reform at the state level. And going into this session, there was one thing you heard a lot of people talking about, including Miro, myself, regional planning commissions, municipalities, all saying this is great. Regulatory reform and investments are helping. We're increasing the pace of building. And I'm going to go back. Will this let me go? It will. If you look at the end of this chart, this is another thing I could do. I could show you just the last 10 years and say, look at what a good housing commissioner I am. I fixed it. But that would be disingenuous. But it's working, right? We're seeing an uptick. When you throw $600 million at a problem, turns out you get a couple units. But infrastructure, Vermont still needed infrastructure to build the units on. And so that was our focus this year. And what we sought was, okay, now here's a new one. By show of hands, who knows what tax increment financing is? That's pretty good. So tax increment financing is a very complex mechanism through which you can finance project, you can borrow against the future increased value as a result of the project. So that's referred to as the increment. We've always had the opportunity for municipalities to establish TIF districts in Vermont. What we never had was what's called a project-based TIF, where you've got a project in mind, you need to fund certain improvements in infrastructure, and for that specific project, you get to use this funding mechanism. Well, now we have that, and It authorized in a bill that just passed and the governor just signed, it authorized up to $200 million per year of increment over 10 years. So theoretically, up to $2 billion could be leveraged through this to expand that infrastructure and to enable more housing to be built. So happy to take more questions on CHIP, which is this infrastructure funding mechanism, or any other piece of legislation. But that was the big thing that happened in the State House this year. I'm going to turn it over to Miro. I'm happy to pause first and take any questions if we want. Right back there. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, Michelle, are there mics? We don't want Michelle to relax and have her lunch, so if we can just keep her running around.
Thank you. I'm really interested in your thoughts about tax increment financing in the context of a lot of economic uncertainty, which we're facing right now. It's founded on the idea that things will be worth more in the future, and I'm not comfortable with that assumption in the current political moment, and I wonder what your thoughts are in that regard.
Thank you. That really is sort of a key question that goes right at the premise of tax increment financing, right? And you're right. These are authorized to take on debt for up to 20 years. And so you're looking pretty far out into the economic future with that. Now, we have a lot of case studies of TIF districts that have had to weather economic storms of the past. And Winooski is a great example. Miro. A couple great examples of successful TIFs here in Burlington. Thank you for that. But Winooski is a great example of one that had to weather a lot of economic storms and still succeeded. Economic downturn in 2009, a lot of other uncertainty that disrupted the economic vitality of Winooski itself. And yet each time they were able to make adjustments and make it work. So the value did hold true. The value increase did hold true. Now, what I'll say, candidly, with Winooski, in order to help make sure that there was still sufficient increment to cover the outstanding debt, cover the obligations, they were able to ratchet up the increment, so the retention, because the way it generally works is a portion is not retained by the project or the municipality. It goes to the education fund. In this case, they were able to ratchet that up for Winooski to make sure that it could withstand that. That flexibility is not currently built into CHIP, but it may be something to consider as we, you're right, recognize we don't know what the next 20 years is going to look like. So thank you for that.
I'll just add on to that. I think it's a good question, and it speaks to some details about, important details, I think, about how the CHIP program is structured and how it will work. Why I think it also speaks to this larger point I think both of us want to make sure everyone leaves with, which is that our work to end the housing shortage, despite 3 years in a row of significant action by the legislature, our work is far from done. We're still building, despite the recent gains, at something like a third of the rate that we were back in the 80s, and that is a function of a lot of bad policy, misguided policy that was put in place over the last 25, 30 years, and we have years of work ahead of us to fully work our way through this. And it is, to your point, I am quite concerned that at this moment when we finally have some consensus that we need to build more homes, we don't have enough homes, that the lack of homes is driving not just housing unaffordability and homelessness, but it is driving all of these other economic and social challenges in the state, whether it's workforce challenges or problems with the healthcare system or slowness getting through our diversity inclusion goals. I mean, so many of Vermont's issues trace back to this housing shortage. We finally have some consensus, as shown by the legislature the last 3 years, that we want to do something about it. and yet consensus has come around at probably just about, maybe not quite the worst moment. 2008 was worse, but one of the worst times in the last 100 years to try to build our way out of this problem because of high interest rates, because of high construction costs, because of this new uncertainty around tariffs and what that is going to do. So CHIP does not solve any of those problems. What it does do, though, is important and big in that it does address this additional issue that so many of the projects that came across my plate as a mayor, and really before that as a developer, a lot of them, if you want to build significant amounts of new housing, you often have to, even in Burlington, where we had the strongest, most robust public infrastructure of any municipality in the state, even here, every major new project required major upgrades to the infrastructure that cost millions of dollars. The Vermont way, it's true what Alex said, that we have had this theoretical ability for every municipality to use TIF districts. In reality, one of the many examples of how intentional policy was put in place to constrain growth was in fact in place with the TIF program as well. No, every state, literally I think every state but one, has a tax increment financing program. Vermont put more hoops and limitations on the use of tax increment financing than any other state, I think it's safe to say, until the CHIP bill. That is now over. That era is over, and I think this speaks very well. And I do think, I'll try not to go too far into the weeds, but the nature of this is if municipalities, which are in the driver's seat, every CHIP agreement needs to go through the local city council. It's a municipal agreement between the builder and the municipality. If those agreements are structured right, as we did do in Burlington, you should never have a situation where the municipality is sort of getting out ahead of over their skis and putting taxpayers at risk. There's ways to structure to avoid that, so you're not just on faith assuming good times ahead and things are going to keep growing. You're structuring the public improvements and scheduling them in such a way that they only happen when the new revenue from private improvements, is in place that can support that debt.
Yeah, sure.
Ooh, can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
So one thing I can't wrap my head around, and I'm wondering if you all can clarify, is on the one hand, we all know that building housing in Vermont is very expensive. We've heard that unless you have public subsidies, units that folks who earn a modest amount of money can afford just can't get built. It doesn't pencil out. And then on the other hand, it seems like part of the idea is we want to build so much housing that it drives down the cost of units. But if we already can't build houses at the high cost that they're being built now, how do we actually get to a future? How does that work, that building more housing drives down the cost if the cost of building is already high?
Thank you. That's a great question. And I'd say there are a few ways in which we're trying, I want to acknowledge there will be cost of materials constraints, labor constraints that are out of our control, right? That is the reality. And so what we are trying to do is provide opportunities where the per unit cost can be lowered by increasing the number of units that can happen on a given project, trying to mitigate things like infrastructure costs. So let me start with density. So one of the reasons we've had such a focus on density is to enable the fixed cost of housing development to be spread across more units, right? And so we aren't, yes, it's good land use policy, but we aren't only trying to concentrate development because it fits with the development pattern we want to see. It also reduces the per unit cost when more can go on a single parcel, single lot. And so that's really part of what we're trying to do here, so that where there is not public subsidy that either brings down the cost or mandates a lower price point for the end consumer, we're at least enabling an environment in which the developer can mitigate some of the per unit cost by spreading it over more units. Bro, anything you want to add to that?
So I think it's a great question, Jason. Thank you. Just sort of adding a little detail to your point, Alex, I think there have been regulatory changes, and CHIP is in a sense one of them, and in a sense it's a regulatory change that have removed some of the costs from new construction. So no longer, and certainly what, as Mayor Burlington, some of the steps we took, no longer requiring every unit to have 2 parking spaces. That can easily save $50,000 or even $100,000 in a structured parking garage from the cost of housing. I would argue, people like to, as I was testifying, I think 8 times for CHIP over the course of this legislative session, people would often ask, why should we be subsidizing, they thought of the CHIP program as a subsidy program. In a very real way, I don't think it is. Really what we had up until CHIP was an additional infrastructure tax, essentially, on just about, on many projects that required infrastructure upgrades. We put this public cost, the cost of additional public infrastructure that will have benefits to the municipality, to the state for decades, hundreds of years potentially. We put that cost on the initial people moving in over the last 25 years. And that could be very substantial costs. It will vary from project to project, but it could be as much, could easily be $50,000 or more per unit. So some of these changes really are going to that cost, that cost issue. Another, I think, important point to understand in our kind of reconceptualization of what is our housing affordability challenge. I think for too long, we've kind of made policy and believed as a state that all we needed to do was invest in permanently affordable housing and address that part of the market. But I think, Alex's slides show this dramatically. If we're at a moment where the Vermont Housing Finance Agency and there's consensus that we need to be adding thousands of units every year, the entire permanently affordable housing system, which is very robust here in Vermont, and we should be very thankful about how robust it is, it can only create about 200, 250 homes a year if you don't have, pre-pandemic, before this massive infusion of one-time federal funds. There's a disconnect there. So we need to understand, even when, I think it's important to understand that when we are building homes, even if they are serving the middle of the market or homes that are not inexpensive, they are adding to our overall supply, and that increased housing supply reduces competition, it reduces scarcity, and when you have that reduced scarcity, the broader housing affordability will improve. And we've seen signs of that. Every time a big project comes on line in Chittenden County, you see some easing of rents. What we have not done up until now is have sustained new supply coming on consistently. And when we do, and we're starting to see some signs of that, we'll finally see, I think, a structural improvement in rents and home prices.
And I think a last comment I'll make before I turn it over to Miro here is that this is all consistent. Our work in the legislature has always helped when there's some, as Miro indicated before, consensus going in to solve a problem, and having reached that consensus and trying to put numbers to it. I'm thankful for Miro's for Let's Build Home and the team for really taking the data approach to what should we be doing to address the housing crisis here, because there's a lot of work that goes into assessing what is the actual gap. And the housing needs assessment, I'm sure Miro will talk a bit about the data that they have shared, but the housing needs assessment that my team and the Vermont Housing Finance Agency produce says 24,000 to 36,000 homes is what's needed by 2030. And if we're building 2,600 to 2,700 homes per year right now, we're falling way short. But what I'm driving at is we are helped by experts that are looking at this from a national scale. Like, I'm sure a lot of folks here have probably read Abundance by Ezra Klein. And a lot of the underlying logic in there is sort of what you're seeing reflected in these reforms and in these investments. But it also served as a good reminder for us and for lawmakers that we need to be careful as we're developing policy, as we're making investments, not to layer on additional burden that counteracts the original intent of what we're doing. And sometimes we've had a tendency to do that here in Vermont. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Miro, and I just want to share that where the state can affect housing is, again, we can direct investments, we can make these changes to zoning reform, we can reduce the opportunity for burdensome appeals which threaten housing projects. But at the end of the day, what's really needed is movement on the ground. We need communities to come together, and there needs to be some entity that's sort of creating a medium for people to express their support for housing. It's very easy to come out and oppose a project because it's a specific thing to oppose. Now, polling shows Vermonters support building new housing, and actually a majority of Vermonters even support building it in their town. But it's hard to get those people who just generally support housing to show up to a development review board, to a planning commission, to a select board meeting. And so that's where an organization, an entity that can sort of be the grounding force is so important in pushing forward what I think people are referring to as the YIMBY movement. So I'll kick it over to you, Miro.
Great. Thanks, Alex. And I've already been interjecting a bunch, but did we skip over, were there some polling questions that we were going to go to the audience with? I think that'd be great if we did that now before I drone on further.
Yeah, there we go.
So, great. So I think there's 2 or 3 of these. So it'd be just great to understand where the audience is at. So have you or someone you're close to struggled to find housing they could afford in Vermont? So yes or no?
Oh, and Emma, is there a QR code for them to scan to vote?
You've got to type in menti.com, and then I'll read the number off for you all. MENTI.com. The code is 71286725.
And that's right at the top of the screen there.
I'll do it again. Menti.com, 71286725. And that'll work for all the questions.
Great. Well, I think the results are pretty clear there, so maybe we should move on to the next one. In a word, this is cool. Why do you think there is a housing shortage in Vermont? We've stacked the deck because of the order.
Way to prime the pump here. Some familiar themes popping up here.
Wow, this is amazing.
By show of hands, while this is populating, how many legislators do we have in the room? Okay, they're in the other sessions. All right.
So we can say what we really think.
They've heard from me. So, do we have any town staff, town administrators, town planners? Familiar face over here. Okay, thank you. All right, good. Anyone from regional planning commissions? Okay, great. Do we have any developers or builders here? Okay.
All right, and let's, I think there's one last one here. We've got that picture there. What do we need to do to solve the housing problem in Vermont?
I'm back. Okay. Oh, there we go. Great.
I have no clue.
Let's build homes right at the top.
Yeah, I appreciate that too. All right, great. Well, so I appreciate you taking the time, and that's cool. Thank you to the organizers for putting that together. I think the overwhelming response is consistent with what we've seen with the overwhelming response to the fact that pretty much everyone in the audience just about has had some direct experience with housing unaffordability is very consistent with national polling. Something that I understand is that virtually everyone agrees that the cost of housing is too high, it's too expensive. And the consensus kind of breaks down a little bit from there, as I think you saw in the next slide. And for good reason. In some sense, there are lots of contributors to housing unaffordability. What we believe at Let's Build Homes, and what we've created now a whole coalition that includes more than 235 Vermont organizations and more than 800 individuals and growing. And I hope you will consider after this discussion, if you like some of what you heard, joining the coalition as well. We believe, that first and foremost, this is a shortage. And it is that shortage, that scarcity, which more than anything else is new, is not the historic norm, and it is that shortage that is driving the cost. The cutthroat competition for scarce resources is driving up the cost of rents, and it is driving up the cost of homes. That's a little bit of a different question than why is a new home so expensive. And that kind of goes to the question we were speaking to before. And many of those factors that people typed in, I think, are contributors to why new homes are so expensive. But it is this cutthroat competition that is this sort of overarching driver of our problems. And that's why we, as the solution, have focused on expanding that supply, increasing the number of homes of all shapes and sizes for people of all backgrounds and incomes, as the way to work our way out of this shortage, out of this problem. And happily, there are starting to be more and more examples around the state, around the country, around the world of this kind of focus on results, this focus on new homes, improving the situation. Now, some people may chuckle when I offer this, but I do actually think Burlington's experience over the last 12 years is starting to be an example, an indication that this is a path. When I came into office 12 years ago, our housing market in many ways was dead. There had been something like 18 homes built in a decade in the heart of the downtown, and that was through a period of one of the great housing booms in American history. We had, and I knew this, having been a developer who tried to build in Vermont, we had in many ways broken the ability of new homes to get built. And for 12 years, we focused on turning that around, and I'm happy to say after that 12 years, by some measures, there is now like a fourfold increase in the amount of new homes that are coming online in Burlington. There were moments that even looked like it would help with the vacancy and the rent situation. I remember when the Champlain College project came online on St. Paul Street. We actually saw property owners competing for renters for the first time in a way that people hadn't seen in decades. That didn't last, though, with the pandemic and with the huge influx in demand that came in association with the pandemic. And now, in many ways, it feels like things are worse than they've ever been. But I still believe in this solution. You look other positive signs that this is a solution. You look to Austin, Texas. You look to Minneapolis, Minnesota. These are places that have a sustained focus on bringing more homes of all shapes and sizes online, and they've actually seen real departure in their statistics, their metrics on rents versus other peer cities in recent years. You look around the world, and there's even more examples. I mean, who would have thought Tokyo, of all places, has become a great success story? We think of Japan as an expensive place. It's not with respect to housing costs. It is a fraction of what New York City residents, for example, pay in Tokyo. So that's what this coalition is about. It is about bringing on, it's building more homes of all shapes and sizes. I'm not suggesting we're building, and maybe I got to change up my pitch here a little bit. We're not going to be building Tokyo skyscrapers anytime soon, but we do believe that every community in Vermont should be able to more easily bring homes that are appropriate for those communities online. Big, we've talked, I think, enough, unless there's more questions about CHIP. Looking ahead, where does this coalition go in the future? We do think that one of the big steps that was up there, and I would sort of call this out for people who kind of care about housing and care about land use in Vermont, this vote by the legislature a year ago on Act 181, this first reform of Act 250 in 50 years, was a very significant vote in of itself. And at the same time, the most significant thing it did is it started a process for drawing new land use maps, new tier maps that will divide every acre in the state into one of three tiers, Tier 1, Tier 2, or Tier 3. And Tier 1 will represent our consensus, the consensus we've never had as a state about where we want growth and where we want new homes in the future. And how those maps will be drawn is really quite uncertain right now. There was some direction in the legislation, but it started a long and complicated process involving the regional planning commissions, municipalities, and this new state board, the Land Use Review Board, or inelegantly called now the LURB. And I suspect even the legislature is going to have to get involved further before this is done, and the governor, because this was such a big change that there will probably need to be some tweaking of it in the years ahead. So it's a big multi-year process. It's the thing that Let's Build Homes is going to be most focused on one way or another going forward from here, and I encourage people to tune into that. I think with that, why don't we open the floor back up for any further questions?
And I see a question here. While folks ponder those questions, I'll just lean into that last point and just encourage folks, please engage in that future land use mapping process. Draft maps have begun to be published by the Regional Planning Commission, so just observe that process and please comment and take part.
So you acknowledge that one of the problems is an increase in demand. And with, certainly with COVID, people came in. I talked to a lot of my students. They say like half the houses in their town were bought up by out-of-staters. Apparently during the census, like 20% of Burlington homes were not owner-occupied. But all your solutions are increasing supply, where it does seem to me we have 7 million second homes in this country and 600,000 homeless. Vermont has the second highest number of second homes, the second highest number of homeless. It strikes me as the problem is excess demand far more than inadequate supply. And that we're just allowing people to snap up our homes and pay very low taxes and they're not using them. And it is, I'm curious if there's any of that in your solutions.
Yeah, I think it's a great. Let's kick that around. I think that sentiment is shared by a lot of folks. And we acted on that sentiment in Burlington as part of the reforms that we put in place over my 12 years. One of them was a new short-term rental regulation that put limits on people's ability to turn their ADU or one unit of the. It put limits on the. It didn't prohibit them, but it put limits on the ability of people to create short-term rentals in Burlington. And there's actually I haven't read it carefully, but I understand that regulation was just upheld by I believe the environmental court just recently. So that that is in effect, and it's one of the things that I felt we should do and we needed to do when we had such a severe shortage. And I think there's more work to be done with the implementation of that, although it did seem like it had the desired effect in that the number of short-term rentals was nothing like 20%. It was, at its peak, my understanding of the stats has got up to something like 700 out of our 20,000 units were being short-term rented, and that's back down. Last time I looked at the stats, it was in like the 300 to 400 range, and it seemed like even though there was some more work to do with the implementation, that had some of the desired effect. I think the state is considering, and you may be able to speak to Alex, there may be some action at the state level to put some regulation on this as well. I think as long as we're in the scarcity that we are now, it is appropriate to think about that. I will at the same time say I don't think that's optimal. I think there should be, we want visitors coming here. We want people to be able to spend part of the year here near their grandchildren. It is good for the state economically, I think, if you have that kind of economic activity going on. And it's really, I think, kind of a scarcity mindset that we're in if we're having to, and a scarcity reality we're in, if we're having to choose one over the other. I think it would be far better if we got to a place where we built for both of those markets and serve both of those markets. And I think we can do that while certainly there being some, we will look like a different community after doing that. You cannot build the kind of numbers of housing we need and not see it. On the other hand, we will be a different community if we don't build as well. We will be it may look more like what it does currently in terms of the physical structures, but it will be a place where the middle class, where people who are not very wealthy, those second homeowners, or people getting enormous support from the government are squeezed out and are unable to live here. And there's lots of examples of that. We have far fewer young professionals living in Burlington now than we did 25 years ago. That's the kind of change that we put on ourselves if we don't evolve and change.
Yeah, I think there were a couple pieces to the question, right? And so there is sort of the acknowledgement of short-term rentals as a property use, as well as this other sort of bigger conundrum of we are a state, as other northern New England states, where their properties are used as second homes. A good swath of those are seasonal homes, and so when you start breaking down how many how many second homes are actually could be available for year-round occupancy, how many of those are at a price point or located geographically in a location that would actually serve a typical primary homeowner or resident, the numbers do dwindle, but the point remains the same, and I want to acknowledge the validity of the point you're making, and I think it's something to certainly take into account. For example, with the education funding conversation and what rate properties are taxed. But I guess I do want to reinforce Miro's point about I think that scarcity mindset has caught us in a trap in the past in Vermont and actually prevented us from making the changes that we needed to enable growth, to actually ease all parts of this conversation and create abundance and opportunity for everyone. So while we want that to continue to be a part of the conversation, we don't want to go back to the days where people would, and just sort of keep us trapped in that loop. On short-term rentals, just because the data is sort of fresh in my mind, it did peak in 2023 around 12,000 properties that were for at least a portion of the year listed as a short-term rental. So that's a little over 1% of the state's housing stock. The reason I think we heard a lot about it is because there were certain communities where it wasn't 1%. It was far higher. So if you're in Lamoille County around or near Killington, these near resort areas where there are higher rates of short-term rentals, those communities felt it more acutely. And in some cases, those municipalities chose to take an action to either change behavior or at least drive some revenue off of that to help create more housing stock. But so when I'm thinking about statewide solutions, I need to think about what's going to be sustainable and what's going to create real sort of bang for the buck, a significant and lasting impact. Of the 12,000 homes that at the peak were listed in short-term rentals, the data showed that of those, maybe about 7,000 could possibly be occupied year-round, either because they were actually a full home, whereas some of the others were just a room on a property, or they were a property that was not eligible for year-round occupancy. It was a seasonal property. So now we're looking at about 7,000 possible properties that you could think about through regulation trying to change the use to either long-term rental or some other use. that would achieve 1 year of our housing targets. So, for me, that would be a massive regulatory shift that would complicate a lot of property owners' lives in Vermont that I'm not sure is the best long-term solution holistically for Vermont, for many of the points that Miro raised. It's not that we shouldn't take some nuanced action to encourage different behaviors. I just don't want to look at those as the solutions. So,
Let's hear from Chris and then Jason. Thanks.
Is this on? Hello. Hey. Chris Campen, Executive Director, Wyndham Regional Commission. I think part of the challenge we have, I think 281 is helpful. Doing the, like delineating development areas and regional plans makes sense. We'll be working with municipalities to do that. But I still think one of the fundamental challenges we're facing, and this is not just a Vermont challenge, it's a New England challenge, is the diffuse decision-making around capital planning, capital investment, not just for new housing, but even evolving where we have developed up and away from flood hazard areas so that we're not going to continue to lose the existing older housing stock that we have. And the challenge we have at, of course, a regional planning level is we don't own anything. We have no assets. We don't do capital investment. We don't do capital lending. We don't tax. And so, like in our region, we've worked with some of our towns to develop, wastewater systems, but this EPA constrained. So basically, they're able to. It's really more water quality that they're addressing. It doesn't really help them grow. Statewide, DEC really kind of is in charge of administering the water and wastewater grants. They're a regulatory agency, and generally speaking, they're passing through federal funds which have their own stipulations, and a lot of that is water quality money. So I think one of the things we need to really think about is what does a statewide capital investment strategy, capital financing, capital bonding look like? The TIF stuff will help, but you're still having to make decisions on a town by town by town by town by town basis times 250. Now, of course, we're not all of our towns are going to do that, but this is a challenge I think that New England has, and I think it's something that really, using the universities, doing research, looking at what the challenges are, what some possible solutions are, what Vermont-based governance and implementation strategies would look like would be helpful. But maybe we even do this, frankly, in collaboration with Massachusetts, Maine, New Hampshire. I used to be Deputy Commissioner in Planning for Orange County, New York. We were dealing with this after 9/11 with the surge of growth. We were dealing with the same issues because we had county government, we had some county infrastructure, but still is left up to dozens of municipalities to figure out how to invest or if to invest. And as you guys know, sometimes for a select board to even take up a discussion can take, and I'm not kidding, 10 years, right? To decide to have a conversation, much less have a conversation and then make a decision. So at some point, we're going to have to get into the hard stuff. I don't know if the county and regional governance committee discussions are going to continue. That was part of Act 181. But anyway, this is not gloom and doom, but it's just reality, because I've worked in other structures, and we're really challenged with this 1600s era governance structure that we've got. I'm not sure it works well in 2020.
No, you're right, Chris, and obviously you're also participating in the VERTA study, which is examining rural technical assistance, which is related to these same issues. So this goes beyond just capital investment planning, right? I mean, this is very much intertwined. I'm sure folks paid attention to the education debate that sort of resolved last night. This sort of diffusion of planning, of control, of resources, and really the impact that has on rural Vermont disproportionately. So you're right to point it out. It is at the center of every conversation, and I think Miro has a solution, right? What do you?
Well, I was curious on your answer there, and that I do think there's an opportunity and probably a need for some greater possibly state action, some kind of action on the regional level. I think there's a legitimate concern to raise, and I'm pretty interested in that discussion. At the same time, I am a local government guy, and I think we underestimate the progress and the potential of local governments that want to do something about this issue to get something done. I think we have increasing examples in Vermont. I gave you the Burlington examples. There are also Fairleigh, Vermont, is in the process of really rebuilding the entire small downtown that they have. There's no getting away, I think, in our system. No matter how we try to structure it, it is going to be very hard to make progress without the municipalities wanting to and being a partner in that. And I think where we hope Let's Build Homes can have an impact, and where I think everyone in the room should feel like they can have an impact, is with their very accessible local government, this new tool that we have given local governments with CHIP. There's no excuse now for any local government not to. They can no longer say we just can't afford the infrastructure. There is now this very powerful new tool that, if used creatively, I think can address a lot of the situations that you were talking about there, Chris. And I'm feeling a great enthusiasm for it, and a great sense of interest is what I heard certainly from the Vermont League of Cities and Towns. I think you're going to see, now that we have made this structural change to the way the financing works, and kind of restored what used to be a local ability to use future property taxes to drive growth, I think you're going to see Vermont municipalities going back to what municipalities have always done as long as we've had municipalities as a society, or other societies, is to drive. That's a big part of what municipalities were created for, was to drive growth and expansion. And I think you're going to see more of that happening now with this important piece of legislation.
And I'll just, I want to tack on to this point about municipalities taking an important and often leading role in some cases in at least enabling home building. And just to say that we set really ambitious targets at the state level. We were asked to in Act 181, and it was data-based, but it looks really ambitious if you look at what we've done historically. So as a reminder, the Housing Needs Assessment said the state needs between 24,000 and 36,000 homes by 2030. And then as an addendum to that, we said we want to set a target of 41,000 homes over that period to drive different demographic and economic outcomes. That's the high end of the targets, but let's just set that aside. When I go to communities and I'm at a groundbreaking or a ribbon cutting, or a community has just accepted a development agreement for a new project, I like to point to that 41,000 number and say, don't look at it. That's a big, scary number, and I can't picture 41,000 homes. But the regional planning commissions have done really good work to bring those down to first regional levels and then to municipal levels. And CCRPC and Northwest have published their municipal targets. But more important than the numbers is, I love going to a groundbreaking and saying, this project that you just said yes to will go a long way towards meeting your goal. Because I have a hard time telling a community, here's what 41,000 homes is going to look like in Vermont, but I can point to what Shelburne just did to say yes to a lot of homes in their community and say, that right there, that's what it looks like. If you can do that, you're well on your way. Middlebury also. So I love being able to point to projects and say, that's what it's going to look like for you. Right size it to the scale of your community, of course, but that's what it looks like. It's the community saying yes.
All right, I think we got to go to rapid fire mode now. Jason, go ahead.
Check for Alex. There we go. First, a data check for Alex. You said there's 12,000 short-term rentals in the state, and that represents 1% of the housing stock. Do I understand that to mean that there's 1.2 million housing units in Vermont, twice as many as there are people? And if not, if you could correct that, that'd be great. And then a question for Miro. Hawaii has a graduated property tax system where second homes and other classifications of homes pay a significantly higher rate than owner-occupied homes. Will Let's Build Homes be an advocate for that? And if not, why not?
Thanks, Jason. You're right. I stand by the 12,000. I don't know if you could see, I was looking through my notes to get the percentage right. So that's clearly not the right percent of the housing stock for STRs. Good check on that.
And it's a fair question, Jason, and I will I will say maybe on that one. I just genuinely have not. I've never fully understood. I'm still a little bit new. We're 6 months old. Still a little bit new to some of the Montpelier debates on the way the state sets the different rates, and I've never fully understood that. I've been, I think I don't know the issue as well as I should, but I think it's a fair question. Tino?
Hey, thank you very much. I'm here representing the Vermont Professionals of Color Network. And I think part of the challenge that I see within the BIPOC community is the fact that we just don't have access to housing, period, as community of color. And part of the challenge is the NIMBY environment, not in my backyard environment that's there, because you look at everybody in here, we're all talking about housing and how important it is. The legislature has passed legislation, private organizations have done their bit, but I think part of the challenge is that as Vermonters, we are not living our values. And I saw that, and it became real to me this weekend. I drove through the town of Shelburne, and no offense to people in Shelburne, but people were demonstrating about the No Kings demonstration stuff. There were lots of signs there. Black Lives Matter, immigrants have rights. People of color deserve an equal opportunity, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, when I look at what the town is doing in terms of passing legislation and rules to allow new housing developments to happen, there's a lot of NIMBYism that is happening within the state and within towns around Vermont. And so, for me, I'm just wondering, how do we start to live our values as Vermonters? If we're going to demonstrate on streets, we also need to make sure then that if we're saying immigrants have rights too, then immigrants also have rights to housing. And so I think somehow we've got to get past this point of trying to find silver bullets and perfect solutions and actually just start building housing. Because I know if I asked a poll here of all the Black and brown people in this room, how many people own their own houses, I think the answer will be very surprising to you. If probably not even surprising, because we all know what the answer is. 80% of all Black people in the state do not own a house. And so for me, I think it's just important that we stop trying to find the perfect solutions and just start to figure out how do we create opportunities for folks of color to own their own houses, and how do we get past the NIMBYism that is happening within the state of Vermont in order for folks to be able to have affordable and real housing. Thank you.
Thank you, Tino, not just for that, but for you've been consistent on this for years in your role as head of the Vermont Professionals of Color and in your personal capacity. And we're very grateful that you joined the Let's Build Homes board to be part of the fight from that route as well. Obviously, I completely agree. It is another one of the social and economic challenges that we face right now that we will make progress on when we find a way to build more homes and reduce the scarcity that we have right now. Something that I heard, Kevin Chu has started saying from the Vermont Futures Project, I think it's well stated, and it kind of along the lines of some of your points there. You hear a lot in Vermont that housing is a human right. If we're going to make good on that value, which I think is one that is widely shared, then there needs to be a right to build housing, and there is not currently. Literally, there's not. Almost every, with very few exceptions, if you apply for a housing permit and get a permit to build it, that is not a right that you then have to build it. It is something that can be challenged and literally relitigated 2 or 3 or 4 times. We've got to move away from that. It's all right for us there to be NIMBY sentiment out there. It's human nature, I think, to be concerned about change and what might happen. We need to move away from a system that empowers that NIMBY sentiment to just lock things down and gives far too many vetoes. We need to have communities be able to move forward and build the homes that they want to build. So I think it's a good place to close. I think we've run out of time here. Thank you to the organizers of the Rise Summer. What an incredible day. And thank you for including us in this important discussion.